Welcome everyone joining us in Australia and around the world, both in person and online, to this public panel on the topic China and the Left, hosted by Platypus ANU. My name is Connor and I'll be the moderator for this event. This is the third panel hosted by Platypus ANU. Platypus Affiliate Society, established in December 2006 in Chicago, organises reading groups, public fora, research and journalism focused on the problems and tasks inherited from the old 1920s to 1930s, new 1960s to 1970s, and post-political 1980s to 1990s left, all for the possibility of emancipatory politics today. You can learn more about our activities on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter through @PAS1917ANU or by visiting our website, platypus1917.org. We also have a podcast titled Shit Platypus Says, which can be streamed on SoundCloud, and a monthly international open access publication called Platypus Review. You'll find free copies available from Ali or me.
Message me.
Yeah. The panel topic for today is China and the Left, and the panelists have been asked to respond to the following prompt. What would it mean to call China communist? Is it appropriate to say that Maoism overcame Stalinism? Is China Maoist today? Did Deng Xiaoping betray the Chinese Revolution? If so, how? What lessons can we draw from the 75-year legacy of the Chinese Revolution, and from a century of Marxism in China? Why, if at all, are such lessons relevant for the left today? Our format is simple. Each of the three speakers will have around 12 to 15 minutes for opening remarks, and 5 to 7 minutes each after everyone has spoken, to respond to and discuss directly with following panelists. Then, after a very short break, well, we probably won't do that, we'll have an hour or so of audience Q&A. If time permits, we'll also take questions from the online audience. For the Q&A, I hope only to call on questions. If you in the audience have more of a comment, then I encourage you to work it into a short piece of writing and submit it to the Platypus Review, where the transcript for this event will be published along with selected responses. Our speakers for today are read out in the agreed-upon speaking order. Barry York. Barry York is an independent thinker of the left, influenced by Marxism and Maoism. He was radicalised during the 1960s and early 1970s. He is an administrator of the blog See 21st Century Left. Lachlan. Lachlan is a local tradie and the president of the Canberra branch of the Communist Party of Australia. Christina Veselovskiy. Christina Veselovskiy is an undergraduate student of East Asian Studies at ANU, a researcher and applicant member of the Revolutionary Communist Organisation. Key interests are rural development, biopolitics, and Japanese Fascism. The panel will each be given a 10 to 15 minute opening statement, followed by 25 minutes of back and forth discussion, and then an hour of audience Q&A. After the panel, we invite you to follow us to Badger & Co. or maybe Broga for drinks and continued discussion. With that, I hand it over to Barry, who will begin his opening remarks.
Thank you. I'd like to begin by sharing an anecdote from a trip to China. I was part of an Australian delegation of 19 people. We were there for a month, 54 years ago, in 1971. Among many activities, we met with party cadres. And I remember it well, sitting at a long wooden table. Pots of tea were copious, as were containers of cigarettes. Everyone smoked in China, I noticed. We found the cadres to be very enthusiastic, as were people we met in the streets and railway stations and shops and what have you. But at the meeting with the cadres, I think it was me who asked one of them, now, you say you're threatened by US imperialism in the Pacific, and to the north by Soviet social imperialism. So why is it that China has no significant navy in the military force sense? The cadre grinned broadly and he replied, well, China is a socialist country, not an imperialist one. The imperialists require big navies, we don't. We rely on the people, the People's Liberation Army, for our national defence. China's navy at that time was what they call a brown water navy, coastal patrol vessels, frigates, diesel-powered submarines, small torpedo boats. Today, under what I regard as capitalism with Chinese characteristics, China has the world's largest blue water navy, aircraft carriers, advanced destroyers, nuclear subs. The regime patrols the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea, and it has an overseas base in East Africa and dual-purpose port facilities that can function as a base. This is just one important example of how China has changed since the Maoist socialist period. And I think it is indicative of China as an expansionist power, not a socialist one. I could give many examples from my time in China. I recommend to you a 350-paged work by Chinese Marxists. It's been translated into English now. It's called The History and Logic of Revolution and Restoration. They had to compile it in secret. It took many years, but it's a great analysis on the processes through which capitalism was restored and imperialism has emerged. It's online for free. Just Google History, Logic, Revolution, Restoration. As Connor mentioned, I was radicalised in the late 1960s. In the great year of the left in 1968, I was 17. The Paris uprisings in May that year were inspirational, but we also knew about the Cultural Revolution in China. It was all meat on the same bone, to quote Chuck Berry, one of his lyrics. In Australia, the main issue was the American war against Vietnam and conscription for that war. I wish I had $1 for every street march and rally that I attended in solidarity with the Vietnamese. And the police could be very brutal, as they are today, batons, fists and boots. Now, the Prime Minister at the time, John Gorton, he warned the protesters, "We will tolerate dissent so long as it remains ineffective." And he was just echoing the representatives of ruling classes through history with that statement. Rebellion has always been seen as intolerable unless it is inconsequential. But with the exception of Chairman Mao, he was the only leader of world significance to overturn that and to declare to his own people it is right to rebel. Now I ask you, how could a young migrant working class boy from Brunswick who wanted to change the world not be inspired by that? And that spirit was what led me in that direction of Maoism, which I later studied more seriously. I really like the Platypus Society's motto, "The left is dead, long live the left." I think the first part is manifestly correct, and what passes for the left today tends to be a dogmatic, knee-jerk anti-Americanism that results in people who say they're left-wing taking the sides of fascists, including Putin and Xi Jinping. This places the left, in inverted commas, against the people in places like Russia, Ukraine, China and Iran, who are really heroically fighting neo-Tsarism, social fascism and clericalist dictators. To borrow from Mao, it's left in form, right in essence. So there's a first lesson about the relevance of Maoism to today, I think. In order to build a genuine left, one that supports democratic movements, sides with the oppressed people, and supports material progress, we have to first identify and repudiate its opposite, the phony left or pseudo-left. Another lesson from the relevance of Maoism, in my opinion, is its opposition to dogmatism. Mao constantly warned against formula thinking. He described it as taking ready-made conclusions and mechanically applying them without relating them to the real conditions. He contrasted it, formula thinking, with the living dialectical approach, where you start from investigation. You don't know what the answer's going to be. You start with investigation of reality. You test ideas in practice and only then develop a line that is consistent with the real world. Today's formula thinking is based on the idea that US imperialism is the number one enemy of the world. That was our slogan back in the CPAML in the 60s and 70s. The Great Satan, and the various pseudo-left sects have a position on everything instantaneously. You might have noticed that, because they just have that formula. All they have to do is work out, well, where does America stand? And the rest is automatic. But when this kind of anti-imperialism puts somebody on the side of fascist regimes and clericalist dictators, it's not worth having. We're living at a time when things in the world are changing very rapidly, and the need for a left that is founded on solidarity with the oppressed against their oppressors, and a commitment to modern democracy and progress is very urgent. Mao recognised the need for continuing revolution after the people have taken power. The need, because once the revolution happens and people take power, your society is the same as it was the day before. You need a continuing struggle, especially against those who wanted to steer China towards capitalism. And that's not just, and they were communists, they were in the Communist Party. Now, they won out, as Mao warned that they could. And in 1977 to 1980, there was a coup. Hundreds were executed, thousands were jailed and disappeared. Real communists. I think my analysis is that today China is really ruled by a nationalist regime. I think it ticks the boxes for the definition of fascism in many ways. It's a dictatorship of the billionaires, not of the proletariat and peasantry. And it has a clear economic imperialist or neo-imperialist agenda. Last year, you might recall that Donald Trump called Xi Jinping brilliant. And why did he say that? He was asked, why do you say that? And he said, President Xi is brilliant because he controls 1.4 billion people with an iron fist. Trump's problem with Xi is trade competition rather than leadership methods, as we see. The evidence for Xi Jinping's iron fist is overwhelming, be it the regime's suppression of workers who go on strike, and I can give examples through to the great firewall of internet censorship. Two key terms that are censored, that are picked up, are Tiananmen Square and the Cultural Revolution. If you mention those, you get hit by the firewall of censorship. There's also the Orwellian utilisation of facial recognition technology to control the people. And in some parts of China, they are still experimenting with social credit systems, which, how is that not fascism? There's the suppression of cultural rights of minorities and the persecution of Maoists. In 1982, there were constitutional amendments by Deng Xiaoping, and one of the things that happened there, well, that constitutional reform overturned virtually all of the communist achievements that preceded it, including one which is the right to strike as a constitutional guarantee. No surprise with that. I think the most urgent issue in the world today is obviously Palestine, and I'm using the word fascist a lot, but I think it's accurate. In Israel there is a fascist regime backed by America, and it's ethnically cleansing Gaza and engaging in terrible war crimes. The Xi regime in China, for all its pro-Palestine words, supplied Israel with about $18 billion worth of goods and products last year, including products with dual use potential, such as electronics, semiconductors and sensors that can be used in drones, missiles and radars. Also provided precision tools and robotics that can be used for aerospace components, and also optics which can be used for night vision, targeting and lasers. Oh yes, and aluminium alloys that can be used for missile and drone production. These are dual use in the sense they can be used they're ostensibly for civil use, but they have a military application as well. Palestine is obviously the most urgent issue, but in my view, the most important issue in terms of international consequences is Russia's imperialist aggression against Ukraine. China is officially neutral, but has become one of Russia's most important trading partners since the war began. Russia is cushioning, China's trade is helping Russia to cushion the impact of sanctions. And as with Israel, China exports large amounts of dual-use goods to Russia. Machinery, microelectronics and machine tools. When were the Chinese Communist Party a communist party, China would be supporting Ukraine in its resistance to Putin, who wants to be Tsar of all the Russias. As Lenin said in 1916, socialists who fail to demand freedom of succession for Ukraine are behaving like lackeys of the blood and mud-stained imperialist monarchies and the imperialist bourgeoisie. And that was at a time when revolution was happening. And Putin obviously is no socialist revolutionary. I could go on and talk about how we met revolutionary committee members, what the revolutionary committees were. They were part of the four big democracies, they were called, in the Cultural Revolution. These empowered people at the grassroots level, and they established the authority of the Communist Party bureaucrats and elites, the little emperors, as Mao called them. They exercised political power, oversaw production, and promoted debate and exposed reactionaries. These were revolutionary committees in villages, in schools, in industry, you name it, and they were a foundation of the new democracy. 1982, the rise of Deng Xiaoping after the coup, they are abolished and a top-down institutional structure is imposed. Look, I'll just give one more example. Also, when we were in China, we saw big character posters. They were part of the four big democracies. These, I reckon, in 1971, they were like the internet or social media today for poor people, which China was still pretty poor. And there was no internet anyway, but the big character posters, anyone could get a bit of paper and write or draw on it, criticising the authorities and the bureaucrats. We went to a school where teachers and students had these big character posters everywhere, and they were saying, like, the headmaster wanted exams, and they were saying, no, we don't want those kind of exams, but they were everywhere. It was fantastic, real fervour of revolutionary spirit. Can you believe that in 1982, under the Deng Xiaoping constitutional changes, big character posters were outlawed? You were not allowed to do that anymore. Bear in mind that in 1982 and the later years, the global capitalist media regarded Deng Xiaoping as, quote, the greatest little man in the world. And you can see why. Now, I reckon I've done my time. I don't want to be greedy, but I could give more examples. But in the discussion, and if anyone wants to ask me about that or the good old days of 1968, you're more than welcome. But thank you for that.
We'll now go to Lachlan.
Thank you very much. To preface my statement, I will make clear the position of me and my party. That is that, 1, China is a socialist, democratic country guided by Marxism. 2, that Deng and the reforms associated with him were not unique to Marxism, they were not a break from Marxism, and they certainly were not a betrayal of the socialist project. 3, that China and the CPC should be a source for inspiration and a subject of study for leftists in Australia. To make sense the way China acts and behaves requires a close study of Marxism and the material conditions which China finds itself in. In this statement, I want to provide a brief outline of why the CPA holds this position. We do not come to a position on such a divisive topic lightly. Our policy is determined by study and debate. So I'll begin with a quote from Karl Marx in his text, The German Ideology. Communism is for us not a state of affairs which is to be established, an ideal to which reality will have to adjust itself. We call communism the real movement which abolishes the present state of things. The conditions of this movement result from the premises now in existence. What I want to remind you all with this quote is that Marxism is a science, not a program from which we establish our post-capitalist utopia. Reality cannot adjust itself to our ideals, however noble they may be. Rather, communism is the movement that aims to give the proletariat conscious and democratic control over the direction of society. How exactly a society will develop socialism is not something we can predict. The proletariat, liberated and in control of the levers of power, will gradually shed the fetters to social progression. No party or individual can impose onto the proletariat what it must discard or what it must desire. In addition, the utopian abundance that many socialists wish to attain can only be delivered in proportion to the existing productive capability of that society. During the Cultural Revolution in China, there was an illusion of accelerating economic development through the calls for mass mobilization and mass enthusiasm. But this approach failed. It contrasted from the earlier practice of the CPC to allow different forms of ownership and the use of material incentives. In a 1957 speech by Mao, he addressed the policy of paying interest to the capitalists, saying, "At this small cost, we are buying over this class. By buying over this class, we have deprived them of their political capital and kept their mouths shut. Thus, political capital will not be in their hands, but in ours." However, the Cultural Revolution put a temporary halt to this form of socialist development. It led to a premature sense of entitlement to welfare that Chinese society couldn't yet materially provide for itself. Workers came in hours late, were absent, and lacked commitment. By this reduction in working hours and effort, the work required to reproduce society would be increasingly heaped onto a shrinking section of the working class, who would have to work harder to provide for the welfare of the other section. It takes economic development to be able to provide real increases in quality of life. Until then, we can't expect one section of our class to work while the other takes it easy. What it took to return China to a path of development was to introduce material incentives and develop the productive forces. With the condition, however, that the commanding heights of the economy remained publicly owned. Now, in 2025, China has developed an economy that is able to provide a moderately prosperous society that CPC set as an aim in the National Congress in 2012. Now, to make sense of China's governance and foreign policy, it is essential to have a thorough understanding of the structure of world trade and finance. What must be understood is that the global economic system is not a neutral arena. The Western world and the institutions it created at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944 designed the world economy to benefit a few nations at the expense of many. The global south manufactures the goods, mines the resources, and farms the food for the citizens of the global north to consume. Yet they are stuck in poverty while the West enjoys a quality of life that it simply couldn't support without the exploitation of poor nations. This is due to the use of the dollar as the world reserve currency and the hundreds of military bases littered around the world. Those two things are also dependent on each other. The world is required to use the US dollar in international trade by the threat of military intervention, and the costs of this huge military presence is possible by the high demand of US dollars. But why is this relevant to China? 1. Because part of the project of China's foreign policy has been to organise the global south to escape this cycle of exploitation. 2. To establish a new standard for international diplomacy, one based on non-intervention. The CPC knows that exporting revolution is a failed policy. The result of making parties financially reliant on a foreign nation is that the revolutionary theory of said parties too often becomes an adoption of the theory from the sponsoring nation. This was common of communist parties supported by the Soviet Union and led to the failure and splitting of many parties. Non-intervention as an international standard would disarm the West from forcing the subordination of nations. As we can witness from many instances in history, if a country in Africa or South America develops the slightest hint of independence, it is promptly couped and sanctioned. For nascent socialist nations, this means the loss of public confidence in the Marxist approach to providing a better life. The only way a poor nation can remain socialist or independent is typically to become hyper-militarist to defend against Western attacks. Or the socialist nation could open its doors to capital and thus remove that main antagonism. A nation with a population unexploited, with its markets closed, is a source of aggressive, insatiable desire for the capitalist. All efforts will be made to expand into that territory by whatever means necessary. So for China, allowing Western capital into its country defanged the imperialist nations. They could lift the boot of imperialism off their neck ever so slightly. As Jiang Zemin said, they could hide their strength and bide time. With the new capital entering the country, China was able to, with their successive 5-year plans, make slow but concrete gains and change their economy from one based on cheap manufacturing to one based on groundbreaking technology and automation. Something Western economists didn't think was possible. China, with its state-directed market economy, was able to break through the barriers created by the West and that keep poor nations in perpetual servitude. With this success, the CPC began building the institutions and infrastructure that will allow exploited nations to also break these barriers. Through BRICS and the SCO, exploited nations are able to reduce their reliance on the West and find much-needed funding for vital infrastructure. It is this attack on imperialism that is causing a crisis in the West. The empire, with the USA at its head, has overextended itself. Vassal states, like Australia, are being forced to pay levies in order to save the mothership. Or to put it another way, imperialism is coming home. So it's up to the working class of the West to decide whether it wishes to go down with the sinking ship or to build bridges with the global South. This is what we in the CPA are actively doing. Every year, members of our party go to Cuba to learn, work, and have fun. And just last week, our president met with members of the Vietnamese Central Committee, where it was agreed we would cooperate on information sharing, theoretical exchanges, and enhanced collaboration in communications, publishing, and public mobilization. And of course, We share consistent dialogue with our fraternal party, the CPC. To conclude, China is interested in helping countries develop and is committed to the communist movement. But in its non-interventionist spirit, we cannot expect it to save us from our vicious capitalists. It is up to us to create the institutions that allow the working class here to be less reliant on the bourgeoisie. I hope in this discussion I can further outline the CPA's position on China. It is a huge topic with many aspects to cover, and I don't expect we can get through everything tonight. But I thank the Platypus Society for setting up the start of what I hope is an ongoing process of dialogue. I look forward to a friendly and cordial discussion. Thank you.
Christina?
Okay, I'd preface this by stating that 15 minutes of speaking here tonight would hardly do justice to the task of understanding the most important political entity of the last 50 years, and indeed the next 100. I want to be upfront about what I believe, which is that I do not think the real existing ideology of the Communist Party of China offers any concrete lessons to our communist project in the 21st century. We can only discuss China in relation to its key role within the planetary form of capitalism that confronts us in the 21st century, and I thus want to structure my comments in two parts. I'll first offer a concise history of where and when I believe the Chinese Revolution made significant steps toward integration into the capitalist world system. I argue that this history was, if not entirely inevitable, a primary outcome of the historically misguided fusion of party and state. Secondly, and lastly, I would like to outline the planetary condition that we, as communists, are confronting, one which recognizes China as part of a planetary capitalist system. We can only overcome such a system by abandoning the 20th century dogmas of national liberation, merging party and state, and advocating for a socialist revolution in stages. First, I would like to provide a history of the People's Republic of China that does not assume fixed, abstract definitions of socialism, communism, or capitalism, concepts that exist at one point in history but not at another. The Chinese Revolution, like all historical revolutions, was highly uneven and had to respond to a wide array of spontaneous desires, dreams, and visions across the population and indeed across the world. It is an oversimplification to say that the CCP's momentum emerged solely because of a crisis of national sovereignty and imperialist aggression. The actual phenomenon penetrated much deeper into Chinese society. The decline of the Qing also meant the destruction of the imperial symbolic order, which, for all its restricted, aristocratic, and patriarchal nature, served as the common ground for nascent class struggle in the Chinese village. During the war, Mao Zedong thought, Mao Zedong Xixiang, emerged as the ultimate solution to fill this gap in China's agrarian north, where local resistance to state authority had a long tradition, unlike in the more consolidated and state-centric south. I do not want to deny the significance of the Yan'an period and the revolutionary semiotics that emerged there, nor the powerful aftershocks that we saw in May of '68. Mao Zedong thought was a genuine harnessing of the libidinal energy of the masses, who were finally capable of engaging in class struggle within their local contexts. However, the contradiction that would surface after 1949 was already evident, balancing various struggles while synthesizing them into a unified national effort against the Japanese and the Kuomintang, followed by the need to build a sovereign socialist economy. This was a tall order, regardless of how one sliced it. If the Communist Party were to resolve this contradiction on its own, it would need to deliver a flawless performance. Unsurprisingly, nothing went quite so perfectly as planned, since the fragmented structure inherited by the communists in 1949 was unsuitable for such a smooth transition. China lacked a unified economy. Its landscape featured tiny urban pockets amid vast rural areas. Urban institutions and the industrial environments were unfamiliar to the largely rural cadres who had spent so many years in hiding. The communists inherited a primary industrial sector from the Japanese colony state of Manchukuo, a territory designed around the violent processing and exploitation of Chinese laborers subject to conditions of bare life. It bears mentioning that none of these geographies come as neutral. Using these technologies, the CCP began to shape its understanding of the universal and the particular through the lens of a state, positioning itself as the sole mediator between these two poles and as the sole driver of social and productive liberation. These visions greatly overlook the reliance of China's emerging industrial model on grain supplies from the countryside. When the Great Leap Forward started in 1957, decades of mass mobilization rhetoric couldn't prevent the collapse of this relationship. The post-leap retrenchment marks the moment when the inequalities underpinning capitalist enclosure first took place, as legal and economic conditions began to solidify the infamous hukou system into place. In addition, new social attitudes towards commodity production began to replace the older displays of Stalinist productive power. The Mao books, Mao literature, Mao caps, and other such objects exported worldwide in 1968 should be seen for what they were: the first wave of Chinese commodities greeting the world of global communication and exchange. With genuine moments of mid-1960s class struggle foreclosed upon by 1969, the subsequent years of the Cultural Revolution leading up to Mao's death were a procession of Rashomon-style theatrics intended to conceal the robust alliance of the party and the PLA, keeping the decaying edifice in place. Even in the often fetishized Shanghai Commune, voting was literally split down these lines in favor of a two-thirds majority of party cadres and the Chinese military. All the conditions were right for the party to relinquish sole responsibility for its Sisyphean task of mediating the universal and the particular, of the masses and the state. It is no surprise then that these emerging consumer objects, which Cultural Revolution propaganda called newborn socialist things, quickly became the site for reintroducing the commodity form into China during the reform years. I would like to delay further discussion of China's post-1978 history until later this evening, as the focus should now shift to understanding our current task through the lens of China and its role in the global capitalist system. I believe that if we are to succeed, comrades must discard the fetishistic trappings of the party state, and to understand that our present conditions all point to the fundamentally bourgeois, exclusionist, neocolonial, and patriarchal character of the system of nation-states both China and Australia inhabit. The core idea of a lot of these left sectarian views in the 21st century is to demand that comrades cease questioning history. The history they suggest presents that at some stage, all communists have faced a series of natural institutions that need to be accepted and worked around: the state, the family, the nation, and the market. They argue that rather than criticizing the bourgeois nature of this line of reasoning, we should instead revise Marx himself to suit the axiomatic logic of real existing socialism. When we stop asking questions, our comrades become little more than sports fans cheering on the Frankenstein-like collection of center-right and right-wing autocracies loosely gathered around China's arm's-length diplomatic pacts, deluding ourselves that they ultimately aim to rival America as one united movement. I am highly skeptical of the dual-stage model of revolution that some comrades put forward, as the historical record shows a tendency to focus solely on the first stage while rarely discussing the second. But for the sake of argument, let's analyze the program of theirs to understand the misguided and, in my view, out-of-touch program for achieving socialism after the state might be conquered. In the mid-1960s, it would have been ridiculous for us to do what Stalin did and argue in favor of building our own Magnitogorsk Scout in the Pilbara Ranges. Today, it would be similarly fantastical to imagine a world where Australia, like China, could compete at the forefront of green manufacturing without the industrial expertise, with a domestic population barely 2% of China's, and to do all of this while refusing to make any concessions to the living standards of ordinary Australians, of the kind necessary to replicate the massive wealth transfers China's government effects away from households and towards export industries. We would be chasing a promised return to Fordist society and living conditions that for structural reasons can never return. This isn't because Chinese laborers work for cheaper and that we'd have to adapt to this challenge. China itself is undergoing massive deindustrialization behind the shimmer of high-tech products. The task at hand involves understanding finance and manufacturing as interconnected industries, each supporting the uneven development patterns now mirrored globally. By 2025, what we once called the periphery of capitalist development is now its hinterland. The fundamental truth is imprinted on our very bodies here in this room. Chances are that your skin is more familiar with the commodities finished in the scorching heat of the Pearl River Delta than with the caresses of those you care about most. Thanks to social media, nearly everyone in this room could probably also place the supposed neon utopias of Shanghai or Chongqing on a map. I'd hazard that very few here could locate cities like Shijiazhuang, Zhengzhou, or Anshan, apologies if I butchered those pronunciations, where the belly of the carbon-intensive beast that is capital lies in the smog enveloping their populations. For all the tools that Marx gave us, we seldom see capital in such a visible form as in all this industrial smog. But the one thing Marx would point out is that beneath this smog lies the territorial and social origins of this eldritch beast. A Chinese labor organizer pointed out in 2014 that if enclosure in England was a process whereby sheep devoured people as they were forced off the countryside and they were replaced by sheep enclosures, our modern-day counterpart in China's urban wastelands is a phenomenon where buildings devour people. Brutal land conflicts initiated by millions of precarious migrant laborers against party officials are part and parcel of the everyday running of the Chinese labor market. Capitalism is not simply the force that undermines and subverts all the stable things that we hold dear. With its other hand, it fashions new social and geographic configurations that reinstate hierarchies, heighten inequalities, and further segment forms of human activity, also that people must sell their labor to continue existing. Here, the distinction between public and private sectors is largely irrelevant when the lines between local, provincial, and party governments become blurred by the complex shareholding patterns of Chinese firms. We have in this system only one instance of the territorial structures that make capitalism possible on a global scale. The neocolonial condition is primarily a contradiction. We must simultaneously accept the never-ending desire to integrate ever more territory into a universal plane of exchange on the market, while keeping the subaltern other, the international proletariat, at a safe distance by erecting national and racial boundaries around their existence. As a microcosmic example of resisting this neocolonial bind, the fall of apartheid in South Africa offers an important lesson. The end of white rule did not happen because the black population sought to establish independent socialist republics in the Bantustans. They only succeeded by seizing control of the colonial state itself. A dictatorship of the proletariat in this country, folded under the Chinese model and subject to the same form of party-state mediation, would be as deleterious to the goal of global socialism as a Bantustan solution to the question of apartheid, or a socialist Gaza solution to the question of Palestinian liberation. If you were to ask what leaves me optimistic about China's present condition, one prominent point, although there are many, would be that China's willingness to integrate into the capitalist system is perhaps the most significant structural cause behind the climate crisis, the greatest crisis capitalism will probably ever face, and possibly the one thing that could lead to capitalism's demise in the coming decades. But even this strains believability. The only conclusion I can come to is that a war against the planetary capitalist system, especially in the metropoles, can only be fought in hell. I'll sum up what's been said by briefly answering tonight's questions in a fire round. To call China communist would be an oxymoron, as communists seek the end of the nation and state. Maoism surpassed Stalinism in a discursive sense, when Mao's signification of Marxism-Leninism paved the way for an indigenous application of nationwide political and armed struggle. Yet in many ways, the Mao years mirrored the height of Stalinism in its uneven focus on production above all else. This fetishism foreshadowed the reintroduction of the commodity form and China's integration into the capitalist world order. I believe that there are multiple Maoisms, each with their unique discursive, affective, and strategic aspects, each with their own energy and corresponding material conditions. However, the state ideology of the PRC embodies a wholly non-revolutionary offspring, one shaped by decades of party-state fetishism. This view of continuity over change neither elevates nor vilifies Mao, Deng, or Xi Jinping. The historical record on these figures is increasingly distant from the current struggles before us. The lessons I take are that our discussion tonight touches on a key dividing line. That's separating communists from those who fear, dismiss, or see as immature the spontaneous living moments of revolutionary violence needed to overthrow the system. Those who prefer Australia's orderly and peaceful drift into China's developmental path under the sterile, militant discipline of a singular party. It's as if revolutions were a clean, televised military operation, much like those I'd often see on the overhead screens of subway cars in Shanghai or Chengdu, rather than the messy, nauseating task of systematically tearing away the necrotic flesh of the global capitalist beast. That is our goal.
That was good, right on time. I'll now go to Barry you'll have 5 to 7 minutes for responses.
Okay. I was thinking when Lachlan was speaking how his party's view echoes that of the Chinese Communist Party. There are many points of view, many scholarly political analyses available for a very different assessment of the Cultural Revolution. I mentioned at the start the online, the history and logic of revolution and restoration was compiled under great risk by young Marxists over several years in China. It was a risk for them to promote a critical view. Please check it out, it's free and online. But there are many books that repudiate the idea that the Cultural Revolution was a failure. One of them is Mo Gao, professor at Adelaide University, The Battle for China's Past. Because as we know, the way history is interpreted by the powers that be, by those in control, is usually designed to promote their own continuing rule. Mo Gao shows how the attack on the Cultural Revolution by the, I call it fascist regime, is designed to say, look, it doesn't work, look at us, 450 billionaires, to get rich is glorious, 80 billionaires in the National Assembly. Another one worth looking at is Han Dongping. I'm very interested in oral history. That's you know, I've done heaps for 40 years now, mainly with immigrants. I think oral history is very valuable because it gets you to the people. Han Dongping grew up in a village during the Cultural Revolution. Later he went to America to study. Then in the 90s he thought, what's happening in China? It's changing fundamentally from a socialist to an obvious capitalist, state capitalist system. So he went back and he decided to go back to his village and do something that I wish the people who are so critical would consider doing: ask the people. He's Chinese. He had credibility among his village cohort. He interviewed 200 people. Overwhelmingly, they felt things had worsened under the capitalist system since the abolition of the communes, which incidentally had a terrible impact on women in particular, and I could elaborate on that. But Han Dongping, he also went to the village municipality, the schools, the industries, and did archival primary source research. And his book is called The Unknown Cultural Revolution, because today, what we heard from Lachlan, we hear all the time in the mainstream media. There's nothing new about, bagging the Cultural Revolution. And I think that's because it was an actual empowerment of people that resulted at the grassroots level, not only in empowerment, but in improvements in infrastructure, in irrigation, in healthcare, in literacy, in education. When the commune system was replaced with private ownership system, a lot of that was lost. And with the healthcare, the commune system funded the barefoot doctors. You've all heard of the barefoot doctors? Well, I met some in China in 1971. They were funded to go out, they were funded to be trained. They were peasants and farmers trained in basic community health care, vaccinations and midwifery and that kind of thing. And once that was one of the reasons why the great achievement in life expectancy was achieved in that period. it just went through the roof under the Mao era. But when the communes were abolished and they could no longer fund the barefoot doctors, what happened? The life expectancy started to decline because of infant mortality rates and maternal mortality rates skyrocketed. Now, the other aspect that I'd like to deal with, but I don't know, I'll probably talk too much.
One more minute.
One more minute. Look, I've got a lot here on how China is engaging in economic imperialism from a Leninist point of view. It's so easy to establish. So it's sort of funny to hear somebody talking in the language of imperialism, like the old British imperialists and the Americans, that we're here to help people, they want our help, our motives are fine, when in fact with China it's the same thing of a competition for spheres of influence. And this is established quite clearly by the domination, like in the Congo, of cobalt, where they control 70% of that. The merging of industrial capital and finance capital through the banks and the state-owned enterprises in China that invest in Africa, $200 billion in investments. The use of debt for leverage and exploitation, the exploitation of labour. The workers are complaining. Listen to them. But I shouldn't go on for too long, but if this is going to be sort of published in a newsletter or something, I'd like an opportunity to type up my notes, especially on this aspect of how China is engaged in economic imperialism that has created a billionaire class. But of course, that's great because that's apparently increases standard of living. Haven't we heard that before? Haven't we heard that from the coalition and conservatives everywhere? You know, that if the rich are doing well, you're doing well.
We'll have to go to Lachlan now.
All right.
Yeah,
Okay, there's many things to respond to. I don't know if I'll be able to get to all of them just now, but at the core of my support for China, at the end of the day, is the increase in the quality of life. Is the increase in the standards of living for the people of China. And that also goes to Vietnam and Laos. Yes, there were improvements in the Cultural Revolution, and I find the Cultural Revolution a very interesting time, and some of my favourite revolutionary songs come from the Cultural Revolution. But, and I'll go back to my point, it empowered people to a premature sense of what is possible in their society. The material basis of that society could not provide for the conscious development that had occurred. So you needed to return to a materialist and focus on the productive forces that needed to be developed to provide a nicer life for the Chinese people. And I'll address, I think, some of my biggest disagreements with Christina is fundamentally on the state. I think we have a different theory of state, one that I don't see it as anything that exists outside of a class conflict. I see it as a tool used by one class to oppress the other. And therefore, in the early stages of workers taking power, you need to use the state as a tool to have control over the bourgeois class. And I think that is the core of our main disagreement, and things come off from there. But yeah, I think that's my responses so far. I want to continue the discussion, but yeah, I don't have much more to say until then. Yeah.
That's right.
Thank you.
Go to Christina now. Oh, well.
I'll probably just make this brief so we can kind of get into the discussion thing, because I think there'll be a lot of really interesting, insightful audience questions. So to point out, as Comrade Lachlan has, that we confront a system where genuine improvements in the quality of life have been seen in a generation, which is something quite rare in the present day. I do believe that that is fundamentally true. But one must recognize the structural inequalities that drive that system, founded upon unequal flows of migrant labor from rural to urban areas, propagated by almost direct policies of exclusion and legal denial of household status within urban environments. Many of these contribute to precarious social living standards and precarious labor conditions where people are fed into factory complexes with scant attention to their own health. I would point that in historical perspective, what this would amount to would be to say that the Communist Party of China has accomplished the job of the bourgeoisie in a periphery area of the world that it would have not done so otherwise, and especially on not so short a timetable. That in and of itself is something to be celebrated as an achievement for the genuine progress of world history. However, I would not say that this is the final word in the matter, and that as socialists in the 21st century, we should move towards accommodating further demands. And I think just with that, I'll probably leave it to the floor.
Regarding you mentioned inequality, China under socialism, I think, abundance for all would have been achieved much quicker than under the capitalist exploitative social relations of production. But, there's a funny thing called the Gini coefficient. Everyone know what that is, the measure of inequality. Under Mao, in the Mao period, the estimated Gini was low inequality. For one thing, like with Russia after the revolution when they set up Soviets, the workers not only had control of production at the factory level, they could also vote out their managers. And the one thing that happened was the wage differentials between technicians and managers and the workers were shrunk greatly. There was still a difference, but they shrunk. The same thing was happening in China during the Cultural Revolution and Mao period. So the Gini coefficient was, the inequality was extremely low. Gradually, under Deng and Xi, now, you have the billionaires, and of course they're good billionaires. They couldn't possibly have got to be billionaires by exploiting anyone else. Excuse my sarcasm. And the Gini coefficient in China today has doubled. It's up there with America, similar. And even Australia is less unequal now than China. I find it surprising that, there's acknowledgement that there are billionaires who have influence, who are actually 80 of them in the National People's Congress or Assembly. And that's that's no problem there. They're still a communist party.
If I could just stop you there, Barry, because I'll give Lachlan a chance to respond, yes. And then I think we'll go to audience questions.
As a Maoist, I'm sure you'll agree with Mao, again, when he said, at this small cost, we are buying over this class. By buying over this class, we've deprived them of their political capital and kept their mouths shut. Thus, political capital will be not in their hands, but in ours. And it goes to inequality as well. Inequality was a known effect when Deng and the CPC enacted reforms. They knew the results of what markets would bring. They knew the contradictions and the problems it would cause for the country. But rather, it was a necessary measure to make in their times. You talked about how you believe there might have been a quicker abundance for all in China if they didn't adopt the market system. In the two socialist states that we have that haven't adopted a market system, they are still far behind in quality of life than China, Vietnam and Laos. Cuba and North Korea, while I think they're great socialist projects and I support them as well, they have not created the same increase in production and standard of living as China.
You're supporting capitalism. That's what it boils down to that. You are supporting a market economy run by a communist party that is no longer communist. I mean, it's pretty obvious from what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah, well, if do you want a quick, or do you want to just go to questions?
Let's go to questions.
Just go to questions, all right.
Questions?
Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I want to start with is something that hasn't been mentioned, which is a very common one that I think a lot of people here have heard before, and it's true, which is that China has lifted over 800 and possibly a lot more now, million people, so up to 1 billion people out of poverty. And we just heard today, I was at the embassy, the Chinese embassy, celebrating the 76th anniversary. And we heard today that 100 million rural people have been lifted out of poverty as well. So it's interesting that that hasn't been mentioned, because that's something that's very unprecedented. If you look at all of the big countries, a lot of the big countries around the world, Brazil, India, United States of America, Indonesia, and you look at their history for the past 5-10 years, have they achieved the same thing? And they're comparably big countries. Not even close. So my question is, well, we're bashing China here. What is responsible for this? Okay, it could be forms of state capitalism, and I want to footnote that by saying Lenin also spoke about state capitalism and its complexities in 1921 with the new economic policy. We'll put that aside. But whatever it is, my first thing is, how did this happen, this thing of almost 1 billion people lifted out of poverty? And then my second thing is, do you think this would have been possible without the Communist Party of China? So there are my two questions.
Well, do you want to start?
We could maybe get like other questions as well. We can just kind of synthesize bits.
Oh, we'll do one.
I think that question might be...
We'll start. Do you want to start, Christina?
Sure. I don't deny those statistics, obviously. And I do not deny the significance of them as a historical accomplishment. And I have gone to rural villages in China personally, and I have seen some of the great results that have been achieved under that. But I would not stress that this makes a communist revolution necessarily. And to your second point on would this be possible without the Communist Party of China, this is where I would stress the most lines of, I guess I'd say, disagreement, because it is not taken for granted that one party and one centralized model of state relations, no matter how mediated they are by the intricacies of the capitalist market, constitute the one development path forward. But it would be pointless to engage in counterfactuals here. I simply want to offer that in these villages where I've seen undergoing this rural revitalization scheme, which, as you'd know, does genuinely look at development as something more than this just fetishism of production. It talks about the problems of dual circulation. It talks about the problems of bridging urban and rural inequality. It talks about all these genuine connections to the environment that have to be taken into consideration. I applaud those considerations because it's a great step in the right direction. However, I worry that when taking into account all these different systems, when you have only one representative system for the energies and the revolutionary passions of so many people across that country who have been lifted out of poverty, that we tend to put so much burden and so much stress on one system that can so easily collapse into further entrenching commodity society. Because commodities, for as evil as they are, still constitute the fastest and easiest way to skip all of the problems engendered by the genuine recalcitrance of geographies, of classes, of population to development, because they offer us so much in exchange for so little. And I would say that if we want to move towards a commodityless society, and if we want to move towards the goal that Marx and other thinkers like him in the years since have wanted for us, it is that we need to look beyond having a simple one state, one party solution to things. And that when we take into account rural development and urban development, there is genuine room for democratic emancipation on so many different levels. And I don't just mean the liberal democratic sense of giving people property rights and therefore voting rights. I mean in the sense that of what Lachlan has said personally as well. which is that communism is the movement towards giving people as much democratic control over the context they live in. And you can only do that when you start to implement genuine deliberative measures that bypass what you see in the villages now, and as I saw in the village, which is that all centralized decision-making is done by the approval of the party first secretary, which exists in those villages. That is a recent development. I would not argue for going back to a situation under the Hu Jintao years where you had genuine problems of, say, people consulting with Islamic terrorists in Saudi Arabia, which was a genuine problem in the village that I did go to. I'm not saying that we should go back to a situation where the mosques that people that rarely visit now is now a place of, communion. But what I mean to say is that there are secular institutions that you can build and forge in an environment where people are deliberative and they are non-domination. They are founded on non-domination and they are founded on free association, where you can start to genuinely experiment with the kinds of things that we want to see in a socialist society. And it doesn't just have to come through the one dictated form of a party and the one dictated form of the state. The goal, obviously, is to wither the state away. And when Lachlan mentions that communism is the real movement that aims to abolish the present state of things, we mustn't simply recognize that the unequal position and the unequal status of China's development model as just simply a given, as a necessity, as something to just be lauded upon here from the West while we have our own troubles. It should be something that we should look forward to and consider ways around.
I don't think you can...
Can I respond to that, though, because I feel that there's a bit in there.
It's more of a question for the panel rather than a back and forth.
I just want to
very
briefly.
Sure.
Is that because that to me has logical issues, because you're saying you admit that this has happened, this release from poverty. You admit that there's been millions and millions released from poverty, but it just shouldn't have been the party state, and it shouldn't have been one party. But isn't that idealistic? Doesn't that lack material basis? Because whoever it was, and it was the party that produced this phenomenon, isn't that where we should begin rather than the other way around?
I'd like to go to Lachlan. I just want to frame
Sure.
sort of from Christina's. What Christina said is, like, we've got a lot of talk about welfare, inequality, raising people from poverty. I'd just like to ask, how do you see, the task of socialism, the tasks of what Marx laid out? How do you see reducing poverty, reducing inequality as relating to that? Would you say that is the content of socialism? Would you say there's something more to that?
Well, I wanted to actually address something really quickly on what Christina said, was that I don't, and the party does not want to adopt exactly what China has done. That is not the position of our party. We look at all socialist experiments, successful, failures, whatever, and try to learn from them and apply them to our conditions here. The Australian communist revolution that will inevitably come, I believe, will have its own flavour, if you like. It will have its own revolutionary theory, its own leaders, and so on. And I don't think it'll be anything like the Chinese Revolution, because the conditions are totally different. What a Western revolution looks like is, well, we don't really know. So it's uncharted territory. So that's my response to if there's any sort of feeling that we simply want to do what China did here. It's not the case. And China does not want to export revolution, as I said. That is not their policy. So your question was about standard of living.
Well, how do you see the task of socialism in relation to welfare and inequality?
Right. Well, I think at the end of the day, the task of socialism and communists is to improve the world and the world that we live in. That is at the core of it. And to resolve contradictions. I think it is one of the most fundamental parts of our project. And I think the practice that we can do in the CPA is to improve people's lives now. And so some of the things that we do, and other organisations around Australia, leftists, is to improve lives for people now and to show that we can, if we work together, the working class can support itself without the institutions of the bourgeoisie. I do think it's a fundamental part of our work. Yeah.
Very briefly, and then we'll go to another question.
Just wanted to respond to my friend in the front there, that first of all, Lenin's new economic policies occurred under the power of the dictatorship of the proletariat, or people's power. in the Baku oil fields, for example. In order to develop the oil fields, he realised that he had to invite foreign oil companies. He offered them concessions. I think it was like a product share arrangement, as we would call it today. But it wasn't the restoration of a capitalist system, a market economy. It was a short-term aim towards an end. Now, if with China, there has been a period in history where there's been rapid economic growth, and that was the Industrial Revolution in England. And I see a comparison there with China today. China's the most industrialised place on the earth. I hear Australians and Americans saying, the world is deindustrialising. They only see it from their point of view, you know. The world has never been so industrialised. But you know what comes with it under capitalism, like in China? Sure, everyone can buy a TV, but you still get not just alienation because you're not empowered, but you have 100,000 or so acts of civil disobedience each year. But what happened under Xi Jinping? He stopped releasing the data, the statistics, on workers rising up. And this is very common. China, there's great dissent in China because of the capitalist system. Sure, you can look at many different capitalist countries. People own homes now, or you used to own baby boomers, but you know, but people generally are better off through modern capitalist economic development. But in China, it's the other side to that coin is the great discontent of people. They're not happy. They don't have an outlet for that. And there was one that a strike that Maoists were involved in, a technology company, JASIC Technology. All that workers wanted was to set up an independent trade union. Because like Germany and Italy under Mussolini, you could be in a union, but it was the state-run union, an official union. You could not have independent unions. And that erupted, and Maoist students from the universities went to the JASIC plant to unite with the workers. We did that too in Melbourne with the Worker Student Alliance. When workers would go on strike and that, we would go to support them. But China isn't just now a modern economy. Like any capitalist economy, you have a massive working class who are discontent, who are pissed off, who want more. And they don't have the institutional structure to do anything about it. It's suppressed. The data isn't released anymore. Up to 2006 it was released, and it didn't look good. There were 100,000, they call it civil unrest or something, is the bureaucratic term. So, sorry.
Yeah, all good. We'll go to Mila.
Lachlan, I'd like to ask, do you consider it necessary for socialism in China that the wives of PLA soldiers cannot divorce their husbands without state permission?
Sorry, say it again.
Do you consider it necessary for socialism in China that the wives of PLA soldiers cannot legally divorce their husbands without state approval?
I don't think it's necessary anything what China does in socialism. But I think it is a proletarian state. What happens in China and what they decide is up to them. Whether I agree with it or not is irrelevant to them. In fact, there's many things that I disagree with what China does. Many. And with what Vietnam does, Laos, wherever. But at the end of the day, I believe that it is one of the first socialist countries to emerge. Just like the early market republics, capitalist republics that propped up in Italy and so on. The start of capitalism. These are the first countries that are developing socialism. It's completely uncharted territory. They will get things wrong. They'll get things right. What you think about their policy is irrelevant to them. They will decide. And at the end of the day, I think they are on a more progressive development than the West, which is increasingly turning towards hate and fascism.
As an independent leftist influenced by Maoism, let me say I think it's outrageous, and it points to the fact that China, they teach Confucianism. No longer Mao Zedong thought it is right to rebel. They teach in all the schools. There's been a big push for years under Xi Jinping, a patriarchal, feudal outlook based on what? Obedience to authority. So, of course, this sort of thing's going to happen where women have to get permission from there's so much evidence that China is not socialist, let alone communist. I'm surprised we even would be. Well, I know that people have different views. Good to debate.
Please expand on my point. Very quickly, we need to remind ourselves as Marxists that consciousness follows material development. So we have the luxury in the West with hundreds of years of material development that our standards on ethics and so on may be very developed, and that's a good thing. In countries where violence, for example, at the start of the 20th century, where a majority of China lived in a peasant economy where violence and exploitation was a daily presence, the aversion to violence and so on wasn't something that, how do I say it? Our aversion to violence and so on does not is because of our material conditions. And so what I want to say is that China, while it is now, I would say, on par with Western countries in development, it is still a developing country, and its consciousness develops as that happens. Yeah.
Do you have anything to say in response to that, Christine?
I do genuinely want to yield things to the floor, but
we should get things.
We'll go.
No, I don't think so. No, that's a religion.
Materialism.
I think a really simple one. I just want to hear everyone's opinion on what is the state and its role in revolution, if there is any.
I think, Christina, that would be good from you, because kind of Lachlan laid out.
Yeah, he did. Really elaborately. Where I do agree that, yes, the state is a reflection of class power in society, but we can't organise it along sort of strict homogenous definitions, like you say, because power is so diffuse, and especially in the 21st century, where power has been so broken up towards different financial cliques and industrial consortiums who organise along geographic as much as they do political lines. You have to stress the material essence of these factors that constitute a state. What I define as the state here is the site of contest, absolutely. But it is not a site of contest for which we have one homogenous outside attempting to conquer one exploiting homogenous inside. It is a diverse array of different institutions where people can start to reformulate the ways they associate governance with the improvements of their own material lives, and the ways they associate governance with their own rights and freedoms. And I genuinely believe that in conflict with the state, especially in the way that it confronts us in vastly more complex and sublimely more perverse ways than they confronted the Bolsheviks or the Chinese communists in the 20th century, that we genuinely have to consider that so many fractions of capital which make up this state organize on transnational lines. And this only further stresses the need that a revolution in this country cannot proceed without reference to a revolutionary upswing across the globe. And to that I would say that, yes, China is a proletarian state, but only insofar as it has created a genuine proletarian condition among many of its exploited workers. And that only when these people unite, and they do so in conjunction with other proletarian forces on an international scale, can the actual goal of moving forward from capitalism start to happen. That is not to downgrade or denigrate the struggles right here and right now in our local conditions. But I want to stress that we do not need to have one far out there transcendent goal. If we just capture the state, everything will be fine. Everything will start to fall into place. That is not the way that things will go. And we can't have simple petty alliances with, as you say, buying off the capitalist class. to resolve the fundamental contradiction here, which is the contradiction between what you would posit as universal and particular conditions. I argue it's a false dichotomy. I argue that with socialism requires the withering away of the state.
I'm allowed to ask one more at some point.
I want to go to Paige. Just another question.
I was going to ask a follow-up question to one from Mila earlier. If the idea is that in China, the reason that women in the army can't get divorced but women whose husbands are in the army can't get a divorce is because the material conditions aren't there in China to enable such a thing, then surely, if that's the case, then when during the Cultural Revolution there was a massive upswing in revolutionary feminism, would that then imply that the material conditions in China for socialism have gone backwards, if we accept both of those ideas?
Yeah. What I would say is that yes, the conscious development is possible, like it was in the Cultural Revolution, but it cannot last, and it didn't. The material conditions need to follow. And so the Cultural Revolution was a failure in the end in providing the wishes and the dreams of the Chinese people, and there had to be a change of path. So that's my response to your question.
Can I make a comment on this? During when China had socialist leadership and was on a socialist path, if there were propaganda magazines, I used to go with my dad on the tram into the International Bookshop and we'd look at these China pictorials, and my dad was a factory worker, by the way, and he was always impressed with the industrial and scientific and technological advances that were happening in China during the Mao period. But women were portrayed, because the idea was women hold up half the sky. First of all, wage differentials were reduced. That changed. But the way somebody should do a thesis on this, look through the way the China pictorial, how women are portrayed over time. Back then, they're in the army, they're on the machines in the factory, they're in the farms working, and they're there with their babies as mothers. Fast forward to, the material conditions, blah, 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 to today. They have beauty contests. They had Miss Universe in China. And I saw one of those Chinese magazines. The front thing had a woman all in pink and a dolly bird type look. And that says so much about the position of women in China, I think, under the new regime of capitalism.
Can I respond, please, really quickly?
Really quickly.
Okay. Yes, I agree there's these things that I also detest, much like they exist in the Western world with our fully developed markets. The difference is that I believe China will be able to rid their society of such things when they become so antagonistic to their people. Because their discontent can be concentrated in their state, whereas ours cannot. If the working class's discontent in the Western world conflicts with the interests of business, it is irrelevant. Whereas if the discontent of the working class in China conflicts with the interests with business, it is still listened to. And we see this time and time again. China is one of the only countries that actively execute billionaires. Name one country controlled by capitalists that executes its own
They've got enough
class.
billionaires to knock off one.
Still, name another capitalist country.
And where do they come
Please.
from?
Social democracy with human sacrifice, man.
Name another country.
Who do they exploit to become billionaires?
There was some people up the back who had their hands up. Just yeah, you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, the last speaker spoke at UN conference, he said that China could actually force Moscow to end the invasion, and without China watching nothing. Yet China often stays silent instead of acting for peace. That's what his opinion. So, would you guys say that China's current international stance makes socialism look something more like just a way to be different from the Western countries, or actually is a true following principle of socialism? How do you see like that?
Anyone want to pick that up?
Answer, Christina?
I can open, I guess, and I just say that Since the very beginning of this war, at least in the first opening months, and ever since, this entire conflict in Ukraine has been unnecessary and is only down to the chauvinism of the Biden administration that it was continued. I will admit that there was some leeway and that it was very hard PR sell for Zelensky to continue peace talks after the Bucha massacre. But that does not, in and of itself, justify the continued and prolonged existence of this conflict for reasons that only seem to stoke the fighting of imperialist proxy wars upon the soil of Ukraine. I do not doubt that the Ukrainian people have a will and resolution to resist Russian aggression, but also we must realize as people who genuinely want a conflict-free world that opportunities have been missed. And now we are playing to the Manichaean logic of so many different totalizing theories of the world and so many totalizing theories of politics that fundamentally don't correspond to material reality and only serve to inflate the illusions and the fantasies of the capitalist class, because they want to invest military-industrial capital in the prolonging of these wars. And to cite China's position on all of this, I can't necessarily offer them the right way out of this negotiation process, because so many bridges have been blown up. But I would agree that it does not necessarily reflect that China is genuinely operating in a global tide of socialism, as some comrades would want to kind of gesture towards. Because when you see the kinds of places that China wishes to ally and seeks to enhance development partnerships with, I'm not trying to claim that China is this fascist, revisionist state that threatens our decent way of being, but it is a fundamentally nihilistic way of approaching global politics, because it treats nations and states as historically natural entities and it seeks to do business with them on those grounds. And I would hazard to say that when we mention that China offers alternate development models through different financing mechanisms to developing countries, the funny thing about that is that, especially in the Sri Lanka case, which I'm not going to put forward as this debt trap diplomacy thing, that's an Indian think tank creation. But what actually happened in the Sri Lankan case was that their defaults were to Western loans. And those Western loans were accelerated by the fact that so many of these Chinese loans being granted were then being repoed in US dollars. So when we talk about de-dollarization, we also have to recognize the fact that China enhances and strengthens the balance of trade with the US and therefore the dollar system, because when Chinese commodities flow into the US, Chinese consumers then and firms then buy US capital, reinforcing the strength of the dollar and heightening its unequal effects on global development. And I'll yield to...
We got half an hour, so I want to get through as many questions as possible. But, Alex,
actually, do you want to ask someone else?
Yeah.
To me.
Yeah. So who has a question currently, just so I can get an idea?
He's held his hand raised for like 15-20 minutes.
Oh, and
yeah, I was just interested, since a lot of this conversation surrounded the reform and opening up period, I suppose, to what extent, and this is to all the panelists, was that somewhat of a forced situation, given the isolation that China faced, following the Sino-Soviet split and the other machinations of world powers, versus an ideological decline into revisionism and a kind of adoption of liberal and capitalist ideas. Like, should we conceptualize this as a ideological rejection of socialism, or as kind of a forced retreat due to geopolitical conditions?
If I could frame that for Barry, what do you see the what you would describe as the capitalist road, the victory of the capitalist road? Would you say that was primarily an ideological or material? Would you say that was primarily driven by a change in ideology of the party, or by global circumstances kind of forcing their hand?
Well, the first thing I'll say, responding, China under Mao pushed ahead with seeking diplomatic relations and connections with the rest of the world. It wasn't only in this period of so-called openness. In 1972, I think Nixon went and recognised China as the one true China, and so under Mao they wanted they weren't isolationist in any way. They wanted good relations and trade and so on with the rest of the world. Regarding the capitalist roaders, I think they were ideologically motivated. And as Mao said, you know, dialectics boils down to one thing, and that is that one divides into two. And that in the party you had two different roads, and one won out. And it hasn't been pretty. I mean, today, do you know about China's support for the ethno-nationalist regime in Myanmar? Everyone know about that? That's socialist, apparently. That what they provide, first of all, they've developed, you know, generosity, imperial benevolence. They've helped the Myanmar junta develop a deep sea port, which of course comes in handy for China as well. Chinese security firms support the junta forces, including with drone operations. China is the main arms supplier to the junta. We're talking jets and drones. Socialist? Really? Communist? No, communists support the people who are struggling against the junta, and so should the left. So should the left.
One sentence.
I'll let Lachlan respond, and then we'll have another question from Joshua.
China also trades with the new Taliban government in Afghanistan. This is the policy of non-intervention, the policy of non-interference in other countries' affairs. You're adopting the American policy that the West can dictate what happens in another country, whereas China is operating on the stance that the people of Myanmar, in their struggle, will take over their own country. China does not need to dictate the affairs of another country.
It's not
elsewhere.
trade, it's military aid. It isn't trade. It's military aid, jets and drones. Come on. That's not trade. What are you talking about?
I need that diagram. Can I respond? I've been sorry. I might be too forward here. I just have so many things to say because, first of all, I have to admit I lived in China for half a decade. Okay, and that's contemporary China, not China from the 60s. I lived in China from 2017 to 2023. So what I saw was a lived experience. I lived and worked in China. And one of the things I want to return to the thing to do with the PLA and to do with women. So I was working there with my partner. And one of the things that she misses about China is to be able to walk along the street at night and not be catcalled. And I mean at midnight. I would be waiting there and sometimes she'd have to do some extra things at work. She would be walking through Shanghai from the university all the way home and never afraid. And you could even walk past shops where they leave all the stuff open, the doors open, and all of the goods there because the crime has gone, it's plummeted. And the other thing I want to talk about, you mentioned the PLA. This is something that I think has not been mentioned yet. And that is, Barry, you talked about dismissive of anti-imperialist movements of the left, and you also dismissed the power of US imperialism. Now, I'm very curious about you doing that because how do you explain the history of regime change? For instance, the amount of times the United States has aggressively gone in and couped, as Lachlan mentioned before, killed, and in fact very recently as well, killed leaders of countries, gotten rid of governments, and the list goes on on every continent on Earth. Every continent on Earth. Why would you downplay the importance of fighting US imperialism when they are brutal? They fund Israel through the teeth. The reason Israel is able to commit this genocide is using funds from the United States. And you mentioned China, there's a bit of place to use. But why are you so dismissive of the United States' role in all of this? The amount of times Allende, looking at Chile for instance, killing the leader of Chile, assassinating leaders, going around the world. It's very suspicious to me that you want to downplay the role of US imperialism.
Maybe I'm a CIA agent.
It's very suspicious.
Look, it isn't suspicious at all because what I said was, and I got it in writing, I mean, But I think when people dogmatically and in a knee-jerk way oppose American imperialism automatically without the investigation and so on, and when that leads them to a situation where they support fascist dictators and theocratic rulers. Let me give an example. You asked and I'm answering. An old comrade of mine on Facebook put up a meme a few years back when the women of Iran rose up. You know, every so often there are these mass uprisings. What courage, what brave women. This is a regime that massacred the communists, by the way. The regime there needs to be overthrown. Full stop.
So US imperialism should overthrow another regime?
No, I am not saying that.
Sometimes
no.
US imperialism is good.
You have interrupted me. You have interrupted me. What I said earlier was that when people like this friend of mine puts up a meme opposing the people's movement in Iran for democracy, not for socialism, they want democracy. It was led by women. And what was the meme? This is a foreign, US-inspired uprising. It's not genuine. It just wants to overthrow the Ayatollahs so that American imperialism can expand its power. You're on the wrong side if you do that. You're not on the side of the people in Iran. That's what I was getting at. When Allende was overthrown, I was on all the demos. Vietnam, America was obviously wrong in Vietnam. But let us not end up in a situation where we end up on the side of people like Putin and the Ayatollah because they're anti-American. That's my point. You really misrepresented me badly. That's my point.
We'll go to Ali for a question.
This is a question for anyone can answer, and it's about revolutionary leadership, and I just want to read like a sentence from Cliff Slaughter. For this, organization of a more advanced character, and therefore theory of a much wider and deeper character is required. This means a political party which subordinates all partial struggle to the construction of a leadership firmly welded to the working class and completely devoted to the revolutionary overthrow of capitalism. So I would like to ask the panelists what they think the role and the significance of revolutionary leadership is after Mao. How or what some of revolutionary leadership should we look to in China, and if you would like, you can expand the role of the revolutionary leadership to China now and even Australia.
Anyone want to pick that up?
Yeah, really quickly. I liked the part where this person said the connection between leadership and the party. The way I see it is the danger with being an independent thinker on the left is that you disconnect yourself from a collective decision-making process, which is really strong in developing revolutionary theory. By being an independent thinker, you think that you are the thought of the left. The thing is about being a part of a party is that you're never going to agree with everything the party decides or with everyone in the party, but it's about collectivising our decision-making. I think that's an important part. And then in that collectivisation of that decision-making, you create very strong leaders who are committed to the collective as they are binded by the directives of the collective.
I'd like to say that there are many communists still in China, that the Mao period is still within living memory, that the young Marxists who took great risk in publishing The History and Logic of Revolution and Restoration, which is free online, please Google it, read the whole book, that they are the future in China. But as for party building, I know it's a bit pretentious, independent thinker of the left, but I just don't have a party. That's what I have to be honest. I don't have a party. I have comrades. They're in Melbourne who think like me, or I think like them. We talk occasionally, but at the moment in Australia, And because I was in the Communist Party of Australia, Marxist-Leninist, the only true party, for 10 years in the 70s, it was quasi-religious, and I hear that here too, a quasi-religious type formula about, what will happen, what should happen. I think party building is bullshit, frankly, in Australia. We are nowhere near the conditions that make it sensible to try and build a communist party in this country. All we can do is start at the grassroots and call out the pseudo-left, and from that build a movement, a left movement based on three components: solidarity with oppressed people everywhere against the oppressors, support for struggles for democracy, modern democracy, bourgeois democracy, if you will, because that's what is going. You talk about material conditions, that's what the material conditions reveal, and also support for progress, which of course includes the notion that the communists borrowed from the suffragettes, which is abundance for all. That is a noble objective, in my opinion. They're the three pillars, in my view, of how the foundations for building a genuine left movement. But a party, it's crazy. You'll just end up with little sects who are just interested in each other and talk to each other, and
Christina, I feel like you might have something to say in response to that.
With this notion of leadership, if we draw our eyes to the post-Mao years, I would note that when I mentioned in my opening statement that after 1969, when the Cultural Revolution's genuine revolutionary energies are clamped down upon by the alliance of the party and the PLA, that we entered a state in which so many of these leadership struggles come to us as kind of theatrical, and they don't actually represent genuine material conflicts within Chinese society. In fact, in many cases, it has historically been overstated that the gap between Deng Xiaoping and his cronies and the Gang of Four, they have been historically over-exaggerated, and that these ideological conflicts reflect something far deeper within the structures of Chinese power. And that is that the Chinese state and the Communist Party is fundamentally organized along two key tracks: people who rose up through the revolutionary process, and some genuine cadres who come from rural and provincial experiences. And then the overwhelming majority of them consist of what we would call princelings, sons of former revolutionaries who have been fed and clothed and bathed by subordinates for pretty much all of their lives. And they can only draw upon the pedigree of their forefathers, an emphasis on their forefathers, for their track record and for any hope of advancing higher up in Chinese society. And we have this phenomenon known as the red telephone. The red telephone in Zhongnanhai is only available to people who are in the in-group within the Communist Party, and this corresponds almost overwhelmingly to people who make up the princeling faction. Even when we talk about Bo Xilai, the great mayor of Chongqing, who tried to emulate aspects of Mao, I would argue that many of these were seemingly just display shows, underlying the fact that he was also a princeling. Because when we talk about all these great titanic sectarian ideological struggles at the top, at the great halls of power within China, I'm not going to argue for a second that they genuinely reflect aspects of Chinese society. I'm not going to call for the great coming of someone like Wang Yang or Hu Chonghua, who Western analysts would love to have, because they say that he would restore the reform and opening up years when things were so great, but now everything that Xi Jinping touches turns to crap. That is not fundamentally reckoning what Chinese society is actually structured by. And it is only paying attention to the surface of conflict. We need to understand material conditions that drive what we presently see. And we find in liberal democracy many of these same kind of showmanship actions. And so I guess I'd yield to the floor on that one, because there's definitely a lot to say.
We've got 15 more minutes.
Respond to
We
that?
can also go beyond, like, if people are engaged in the conversation and are willing to, we have the room until 8, I believe, so if there are more questions, we can stay past them.
Okay. Yeah. If this, if the CPC is so corrupt, and the state is so corrupt, it is the most successfully successful corrupt regime in the world in delivering for the people and what the people want. The infrastructure, the quality of life, etc. I don't have to go on again. But also the party is made up of 100 million people. That's a lot of people that contribute and are required to contribute to the party and the party policy. So I just simply disagree with that analysis. With accepting that, of course, there is some benefits and corruption that exists. Of course, the party agrees that exists, and that's why one of their major policies is anti-corruption, which we see day in, day out, someone being tried for corruption. Thank you.
I gotta prioritise people who haven't asked me
Yeah.
yet, so sorry you two, but Boji?
Yeah. I have a simple question. Would you admit that if we have a so-called Marx-Lenin Maoist communist party in China right now, would it be better for all those kind of achievements you mentioned before?
Could you clarify, sorry?
So would you admit it would be, or China could be better if you have a so-called true Marx-Lenin Maoist communist party in power?
Well, I think socialism is superior to capitalism, and we weren't able to see that play out because the people who wanted capitalism won out. They staged a coup, a vicious coup, in 1976 to 1980. Then in 1989, we know what happened there. And of course, I'm told, I hope Lachlan doesn't see it this way, foreign agents created the Tiananmen Square uprising. The state had no choice but to massacre people, including those who were singing the Internationale, run the tanks over them. Who was in charge? Deng Xiaoping, in charge of the army that made the decision to go in hard. And I'm still told to this day by old comrades who have lost the plot, in my opinion, oh no, they had no choice, it was terrible, but, you know, America was behind it, there were foreign agitators. As though there wasn't enough material conditions to cause that in the form of corruption in the senior levels of the Communist Party. It was an anti-corruption, pro-democracy movement, essentially. The left had to be on their side. Forget this stuff about, oh, US imperialism was behind it, mate. No, there was legitimate cause for that uprising. And, yeah, I've blanked out, so.
I've given you two, so I'll give Mila another one, but...
Yeah, I actually want to sort of shift topic a little bit, and Barry, I appreciated and agreed with everything you said about the kind of relationship between China and these various sort of what are often accused as CIA-backed color revolutions. But I don't want you to take my question as a gotcha because it's not intended as one. But I would be curious in this context. How do you square that with your kind of absolute support for Ukraine? In the context of, for example, Ukraine conscripts striking workers. Going on strike is totally banned. More than 80% of what were government assets at the beginning of the conflict have now been sold off to American investors. And I'm not being a conspiracist about this. There is, I'm aware of at least one fascist that is in the upper echelons of the Ukrainian defense ministry, and obviously the Azov battalion itself receives lots of support. So I'm curious how you oppose this kind of, and I agree with you, campist, quote-unquote, anti-imperialism, but that you're also so strong in support of Ukraine.
Well, for one thing, regarding the extreme right or fascist element in Ukraine, in the last Ukrainian election, you'd know that the right sector, that was a coalition of all the far-right, marginal, extreme, like neo-fascist type people, and the Svoboda party, which is the other main right-wing party, they got 4% of the vote. The people aren't with those. It's a democratic struggle. It's not just a national struggle. And might I remind everybody that in 1945, when the United Nations was set up, Stalin, was head of the Soviet Union, he supported Ukraine having independent representation as a nation in the United Nations. Now we have somebody, and I'll call him out, I think he ticks a lot of the boxes of a Nazi, including the ethno-nationalist thing, Putin. Putin saying, no, it's not even a war. How can it be a war when it's part of Russia? So I'm with the people who are fighting that. And since the Maidan uprising of 2014, we've seen that this is a democratic struggle. It isn't just a nationalist one. And if you want to associate neo-fascist groups with Ukraine, also look at their publications and what they say about Putin and Russia. There's far more sympathy for Putin. The Ku Klux Klan, for example, see him as a saviour of white nationalism and Christian values, you know. Whereas Ukraine, they're fighting against occupation of their land, and the reason the examples you gave are happening because they're under martial law. I mean, martial law is pretty serious business.
If I could,
Yeah, quickly.
sure. Just on this subject of the colour revolutions, especially, I mean, it's absolutely crucial to understand that we do deal with a genuinely horrific system of US imperialism, which does overthrow governments and has historically done so. But I would add that this is not one kind of homogenous process. It goes in waves, and it definitely has differences in how it goes about things. For example, in Georgia, or it might have been Moldova, when there was a genuine overthrowing of their governments, the amount of funds that were actually granted by the National Endowment for Democracy, which is the great Reaganite front for regime change, as it's put forward, which I don't deny does do significant acts of destabilizing various regimes, it allocated roughly $100,000. That gets you about an office and 2 salaries. It's really hard to square sometimes the idea that this could overthrow one singular regime. So, and moving to, I guess, Tiananmen, and to even talk about this as like this great instance of either color revolution or the spontaneous uproar of the masses, I would argue that it has a dual character. And that was that when it started as a student protest, it was mainly because they believed in this high idealist notion that Chinese politics were this free and open contest and struggle between ideologically opposed camps. The students were protesting because they wanted Jiang Chunqiao to essentially be released from bondage within self-imposed exile in Beijing. And they wanted him to restore all these great reforms that they had gotten under reform and opening up, because it strengthened their class position as students, as bourgeois sons and daughters of China's most affluent. It was only then, when the workers of Beijing, who had suffered from the removal of their Danwei systems, which is their work groups, which provided them with housing and with food. This had been destroyed during the reform and opening up era. When they finally started to mobilize in response to this, that was when essentially everything had already been concluded. The army was going to be sent in, and the bulk of the casualties upon that uprising were of those workers who corresponded to a genuine class position in the same way the students did. But because the students had so much leeway in the way they lived their lives, they could treat this as this some idealist struggle for some higher cause. But for workers in Beijing and workers across China, of which there are 240 million of them which live in a precarious legal situation which denies them full benefits to employment, this was one of the key drivers behind genuine unrest during that period. And it's a bit farcical to say that regardless of all these different splits within this movement, that it was all just one big homogenous block of, misguided idealists or CIA-funded counter-revolutionaries. We have to understand that in the 21st century especially, and as much as it was then, that we confront revolution as a diverse arrangement of struggles from people with different material backgrounds who correspond to different ideological tendencies. And the point is not to impose one form on them. It is to give them the freedom of expression, to experiment with alternate methods of how we could govern our lives. It is not simply by imposing one form. I have emphasized continuity between the Mao and Deng eras for a point and for a reason. It is to point out the fact that we get so caught up in trying to define terms so much and define eras and paint villains and heroes. We need to understand that this does not necessarily map onto our current struggle today. And our current struggle today is an international one. And it is only through global revolution that we can establish the basic minimum of what we could call a communist society, which is, to be very brief about it, a planetary form of government operating on principles of non-domination, mutual determination, and free association, which harnesses the technological, productive, and human factors towards not just furthering economic development, but also of genuinely repairing our relationship to the ecology of the world.
Yeah, really
Are
quick.
we out of time?
No, we're
got
over
to
time.
8, so we can go for another 15. But
I just want to say it's very dangerous to think that US imperialism is nuanced. US imperialism is the dominating force across the world. US imperialism has control of the world with its many different facets, whether it's the military, the media, or the US dollar. And so this is the first form of exploitation that needs to break down.
Yeah.
do some rapid fire questions just quickly before we wrap up.
Perhaps Barry, who's mentioned this, perhaps he could tell us what he thinks the position is of the people in the Donbass, that is to say the Donetsk People's Republic, Luhansk and so on and so forth, who back in 1915 were actually restrained by Putin when they held a referendum and attempted to, they wanted basically to assert their independence, and Putin told them not. That led to an attack by the UFA on them, which led to actually the defeat of the UFA at Baltsova, which led then to the Minsk Accords. So this was a genuine popular uprising. The people basically east of the Dnieper are actually not strictly Ukrainian, but they are basically either Ukrainians who have ended up speaking Russian as their natural language. For example, the most best representative of this is actually Zelensky, who is actually a Russian speaker, right? And then if you move into the Donbass, that was actually, that has always been a Russian area. And these people literally rose up in 2014, and that led to these military actions on the part of the UFA to crush them. Well, of course, we all know about the massacre in Odessa and so on and so forth, all those kinds of acts of repression. Now, that seems to me to be a genuine popular uprising, right? It is not an invention of Putin. There is, and in fact, Putin tried to restrain them, right? So what should one say about those people? I'd like to hear what you would say about the genuineness of them. As for the domination of the right, well, in fact, that you're quite correct that they actually do get a relatively low electoral turnout. That's quite correct. However, because of the way in which Ukraine has developed since 1991, they have actually colonised significant sectors of the state apparatus and are so very dominant now that they could actually threaten Zelensky. They're basically, I think it was Yarosh actually, who is, I think, from right sector, not Beletsky, who's from Azov. Basically, Yarosh said to Zelensky, if you make any concessions to the Russians or to the people in Donetsk, i.e. adhere to Minsk II, then we will hang you from the nearest street pole. I mean, that's the kind of power these people have. So I'd like to hear what you would say about that, whether you think that's inaccurate. As for the actual sums of money, we know Victoria Nuland has come out and said how much they've spent, not from NED, but from the State Department, and that is in the order of $5 billion in overthrowing, supporting the Maidan.
I think
We'll go to Barry.
people lived in peace and harmony in the Donbass and those areas for a long, long time. Russian ultranationalists and militia went in to stir trouble. The Ukrainian people voted overwhelmingly that they want in a referendum that they wanted to be part of
The EU.
the EU. They don't want to be part
They
of...
didn't actually vote.
Well, okay, the majority voted, and that became government policy. And Putin cannot afford to have a bourgeois democracy next door to him, because he knows that when it works, the implications for him are that more and more Russian people will rise up against his own dictatorship or autocracy. So that's you can call it nonsense, but they're laying down their lives, and up to 1 million Russians have been sacrificed for no good reason.
Those figures of Russian casualties are quite incorrect.
Okay, 500,000.
Let's get back to China. Are there any people who haven't asked yet? The gentleman on the left.
I found Christina's points really incredible. I wanted to ask Barry, because he touched upon what the Western Revolution would look like, given the material conditions are different here. But I want to know how the very many ideas of the Western Revolution look at the absolutely brutal and exploitative colonial past of many of these high-income countries. So, does the ideas of Western Revolution look at what a revolution would look like within the bounds of a nation state, or
Well,
sorry, if I just need to go pee, if that's fine. I'll come back in just a second. I'll offer some closing thoughts, but that's a very incisive question. I do want to get to that as well.
Probably a talk of its own.
I guess I'm a bit old school in that I can't see... I mean, one of the reasons I was never attracted to Trotskyism back in the day was I found the notion of the... you can't have socialism in one country, I found it quite absurd. I couldn't see how you could have this coordinated uprising of the workers in all the countries roughly at the same time. You know, adjust your watches for different time zones and all that. It was nonsense to me. And so I do believe that you can... Probability is that socialism will come about through within the framework of a nation state. I don't know if that answers your point. Am I missing some of the depth of what you were asking?
It partly does. My question alluded to the fact that the exploitation that happened in the colonial past of many of these high-income countries, and the material conditions that they enjoy today are, partly because of, because of the colonial past. So how does the Western Revolution look towards, any reparations towards it within the bounds of a nation state?
Yeah, I'd want to think about that one. I don't have a ready-made answer. I recall that Karl Marx, in his writings on India, he pointed to the exploitation and so on, but he also had a dialectical approach which saw that British imperialism was necessary for India to overcome a lot of the traditional past. He did. It's in his 1847 essay on India. And this is something that a lot of academic types spend a lot of time trying to, explain and excuse. But it's entirely consistent with the Marxist idea that progress is universal, and that a lot of the traditions, just because they're happening in subjugated countries, doesn't mean they're good for the people. So I think there is that complexity to your question that, for example, with India today, without British imperialism, what would it be? What are the positives of the British legacy in India? Are there any? I would think there are. Economic development, overthrowing the rule of the elders, modern democracy, multi-party competitive votes, a free press, etc., etc. It's almost like Monty Python, but apart from that, you know, what did the British... So, I think the colonial past is really in the past, by and large.
That's where I totally disagree. Can I please?
I will. So I
Yeah.
think we're getting quite restless. So we'll go to like
What I've said before.
concluding
Yeah.
thoughts. We'll go
Okay.
to Christina and then.
Wait, I'm following straight on. I'm
You can
following straight
conclude
on.
first. You can
Okay.
conclude first.
Yeah.
You go to- okay.
That was actually great because I was going to mention that I should just wrap this up as sort of my concluding thoughts, and that's that it's very important to understand like what would this look like in the West, because we talk here China, 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 and for some reason Ukraine and India, but but to understand this process can't be solved in one night, obviously, and I don't think it's an idealist fallacy to say that we need to understand that no one form of pursuing revolution is the natural or the right way to do it, because when you confront the logic of a party state which says that everything the party must do, in some ways it almost creates a kind of political surplus for itself from the desires of ordinary people for revolution and change in their life. And I find that to be a fascinating thing, because all of a sudden the state for itself, the party for itself, the nation for itself, you can very quickly see lines of continuity, though not complete association, with some of the same things that drifted Mussolini away from socialism and towards fascism. I don't want to insinuate that we have a condition where China is a fascist state. That's not what I'm trying to argue. And when I say that US imperialism is nuanced, as someone would claim here, I do not mean that in the sense that we should take it as it comes. But I want to outline the condition that regardless of what forms it takes, either hilarious or terrifying, the condition that confronts us now is hell. And that only through hell can a revolution on a global scale, which is the ultimate goal of our movement, actually be waged.
Yeah. Well, I think if you think it's hell now, then it's going to get a lot worse as the forms and the systems of exploitation that the West benefits from start to fall apart. And we can see this in, for example, Britain. What does the British economy have to offer the world? It's based entirely off finance in London. What does it have to do? How does it compare, for example, to the computers that are built in the global south? When the playing field is made equal on the global stage, the West will fall into its I want to say it nicely. It will fall into similar levels of poverty, I think, when it loses this privileged position. And I think that's what's happening. Countries like China and like India and Brazil are organising themselves to be able to rely on each other and not have to work through the Western systems that keep them in a subordinated state. Because it doesn't make any sense. How can Britain provide that quality of life without having a real economy? So yeah, that's my vision for the future. I think that the West is going to have a reckoning, unfortunately, and that is due to the work of China in organising the exploited global South nations to help each other out and evade sanctions, for example. And I think it's the working class of the West is going to have to wake up to this reality and start building a new future, a separate state apparatus for the working class, and start reindustrializing our countries. Green reindustrialization, hopefully.
Green.
And just final concluding statements before we wrap up. Barry?
There's a Communist Party in the Philippines who have sustained the longest guerrilla and armed struggle, revolutionary struggle of any other country, any other party. They even have liberated areas in the south of the Philippines. Read them on China. They know about China. They call China fascist and they call it social imperialist. But please read the things that I've referred to if you want to get a different point of view, because a lot of the things I've mentioned don't get into the mainstream media, and I bet they're not on the reading guides at university. But But yes, I think that says a lot. And we're seeing competition for spheres of influence. So when there's all this praise for China, benevolently helping the South and so on, it really is just imperialist competition. And as Lenin said, you don't side with or support the ascendant imperialism. And that's something to think about. The characterisation of American imperialism is, I think, frankly ridiculous. It's decrepit, it's on the way out, it's in crisis. It never recovered from its defeat at the hands of the Vietnamese people. And you can point to these wars. The worst one was Iraq. 4,000 people died, American soldiers. They lost that in a month in Vietnam. America is in decline. And who represents that better than Donald Trump? His isolationist tendencies, America first, retreat. So this competition for spheres of influence between the two main imperialist powers, America and China, the left should never side with the ascendant one, and that is China. That's my final word, I guess.
All right.